Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra Abad, and I'll be interviewing Viola Russell today about her 2 books.
Hi Alex, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Fine.
How did you get the idea for your first book?
The first book came to me because of something that was actually asked to me. I was leaving a bookstore and a young woman who worked in it followed me outside and she said, I've always thought you looked like a friend of mine, and she's looking for her birth mother. And I wondered if you had ever had a baby and given her up for adoption. And I said no, because I hadn't. But then it made me think, and I thought, well, what if somebody asked you that question and it was true? And at that point, I started to write Buried Truths, which was the first book I had published. Not really the first book I had ever written, but the first book I had published. And I just started to write from there. But I upped the ante. I made it where the girl asking was married to the young man who was searching for his birth mother. And she actually does, and the woman, the protagonist in my book, actually had given him up for adoption.
That's an interesting beginning. How did you come to write your second book?
The second book is Love at War, and that was after my mom died and I was going through her stuff. And I came across letters that her brothers, particularly one of her brothers, Russell, had written home during World War II. And I started to get the idea that I really wanted to tell the story of World War II. The story itself is not just about really my family per se, but I was inspired by the things he wrote. And I wanted to see what happened to people during the war. And I learned quite a bit. I learned, the role that women played during the war, particularly not just, we hear all the time that they did the men's jobs and so forth, but even the things that they did as covert operatives and so forth. And I put my protagonist, Nuala, in that. But also she has to deal with whether her husband is alive or dead, because at one point he's MIA. And so but I took basically those letters and I looked at the things that had happened, because Russell never came back. And I looked at the things that had happened, the things he wrote, and one of the letters was dated a month before he was killed. Later, I met up with my cousin Sandy, who was his daughter. She doesn't even remember her dad. And she let me read the love letters her parents had written back and forth, which are volumes that, probably would hit the roof. And I read them, and I was inspired to tell a love story, but also a story that was a lot of action and a lot of adventure. I start with the summer of 1941, which was right before Pearl Harbor. One of Nuala's brothers is in Pearl Harbor, and then it ends during the occupation of France, and then Normandy, and then later when they have to eliminate some German operatives who are still running around. So it goes through 1945.
Yeah, so it's a very personal inspiration that you put in with the history.
Yes, it was very personal.
How did you find publishers?
The first book, Buried Truths, is published by Sapphire Blue Publishing. And I learned about them through an organization I belong to, my local RWA chapter. And with that, I was sent an email saying that they were looking for authors. And I submitted the manuscript, and Sapphire Blue accepted it. And I was really pleased that they did.
Yeah. So you use them for both?
No, I use Red Rose Publishing published my second book, which is Love at War, and I met one of their editors at a conference, and I pitched it to her. And pitching is when basically you kind of get up and tell the editor your idea,
right.
And she suggested I submit it, and I did.
Yeah, great. What preparations do you make before writing, particularly when you're writing on historical subjects?
I did a lot of research. Buried Truths was contemporary, and I was looking at the stuff that New Orleans had to go through after Katrina, but I knew that because I'd seen that. Right. With Love at War, though, I had a lot of family lore about the war. I had heard about, things that happened through my parents because they lived during that era and their relatives and so forth. But I wanted to know the actual history of it more in depth and more than I had read in college and in high school, classes. Right. So I did a lot of research, and I list my research at the end of that book, but I spent a lot of time in the library. I spent a lot of time on the internet. I wanted to see just what rifles that American snipers used, just what rifles the Germans used, and because there are two prominent snipers in the book. And then also what the uniforms looked like for each, because those are the kind of things anyway readers bust you on all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Explain why you use a pen name.
I used a pen name because I'm also a teacher, and I just didn't want people acting like I was, some famous person, and I don't think I am. But I used a pen name, which was my grandmother's name, but the kids found me out anyway.
To whom are your 2 books dedicated and why?
The first book I dedicated to my parents, and I said it was to my parents who taught me to love. The second book I dedicated to my mother's generation, and particularly her uncles. My uncles, actually, who fought in it. Willie, Charlie, and her brother-in-law Emmett, and then Russell, who didn't come back.
Yeah. Which authors first influenced you to write?
Oh, Lord. Probably the first books where I ever thought I'd write was when I read Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. And I loved it because my father trained to raise horses. And then also when I read Little Women, and I just thought I was Jo.
Mm-hmm.
And from that moment on, I knew I'd write.
Where can your 2 books be found, downloaded?
Well, Buried Truths was done by Sapphire Blue Publishing, which is www.sapphirebluepublishing.com. Love at War is Red Rose Publishing, which is www.redrosepublishing.com.
Great. Thank you for joining us. This was Viola Russell, author of Buried Truths and Love at War.